3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
There is no other institution that has the ability, uniquely,
without a heritage, every generation starts over.
to remind the current regime
what your country.
We, the people, tell the government what it is allowed to do.
to get back in their box and stay there.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
From the Heritage Foundation, this is Heritage Explains.
Let's say you decide to start a side hustle. You set up a lemonade stand in your front yard on Saturday. Your neighbors stop by, and with reasonable ingredients and a variety of interesting flavors, all available at a reasonable price of $4, your product gets rave reviews. By the next Saturday, business is booming. But this attracts the attention of your homeowners association. They're concerned that the prices you're charging for lemonade are too high. In their typical spirit of wisdom, generosity, and economic genius, they amend the rules of the HOA so that lemonade cannot be sold in the neighborhood for more than $2. Being a law-abiding citizen, you go along with the change. The following Saturday, things go great, at least initially. Your neighbors like the idea of paying $2 instead of $4 for your delicious lemonade, and you sell more than you ever have. But when you sit down to do the books on Saturday evening, you realize something. The cost for you to make and sell a cup of lemonade is actually more than $2. That means for every cup of lemonade you sell, you're losing money. You tally up your losses and realize that you ended up with less money than you started with. The next Saturday, instead of selling lemonade, you go find a part-time job at a local warehouse. The leaders of the HOA celebrate their economic genius and toast one another with glasses of lemonade, purchased from the local chain grocery store for $4 a cup. Interesting things happen whenever governments impose artificial pressures on the free market. It's an always relevant issue, but one that has gained unusual prominence since last week when Vice President Kamala Harris announced intentions to institute policies to control the price of groceries and household goods. Here to explain the thought behind these policies and why they matter is economist EJ Antoni, Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. EJ Antoni, thanks for joining us today.
Mark, thank you for having me.
So we're chatting because last week, Vice President Kamala Harris started a conversation about inflation and corporate price gouging. And her contention is that because companies are predatorily raising prices on goods, that it's becoming unmanageable for Americans, and this is manifesting itself as inflation. Do you agree with the assessment that corporate price gouging is a major issue and is driving inflation?
Well, Mark, if you're going to buy into this whole narrative, you somehow need to explain how all corporations across America suddenly became greedy all about the same time around January of 2021, and they somehow weren't greedy for the past 40 years, essentially, because we went from very low inflation to 40-year high inflation. How did that happen? It didn't happen because corporations somehow changed their behavior. They're just the same today as they were 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago. What changed was trillions upon trillions of dollars in unfunded government spending that was paid for by borrowing and printing money. That's what gave us this runaway inflation, the devaluing of the dollar, and also this dramatic rise in interest rates, where mortgage rates have doubled to tripled, credit card interest rates are at record highs, et cetera. All of this has been a tremendous amount of financial pain on the American people, and it has nothing to do with price gouging or corporate greed or whatever other boogeyman we want to assign to it. The source of this is one place and one place only. It's Washington, D.C. And by the way, Mark, the Biden-Harris administration's own data actually disproves their narrative, because the Bureau of Labor Statistics, again, part of the Biden-Harris administration, has data on both the prices paid by businesses and the prices paid by consumers. Well, both of those have increased 19.4% since this administration took office. In other words, all of the price increases that businesses have faced, they're simply passing along to consumers. So if businesses are being greedy, frankly, they're doing it all wrong.
So one of the themes that has really taken off around this conversation is the idea of price controls. Can you talk about what price controls are and whether they're a good way to fight inflation?
Well, price controls are essentially a way that bureaucrats try to dictate to other people how much they can spend on something, how much they can sell something for, et cetera. It's a completely arbitrary and capricious way of trying to determine market outcomes. And as such, it's incredibly inefficient. And whenever you set a price that is below what the free market would charge, you inevitably create shortages. And this isn't simply pie in the sky theory, but we have seen this practically. We have seen this repeatedly throughout American history, perhaps most notably when Nixon, Ford, and Carter imposed their own price and wage controls. And what happened, for example, during that time when we imposed price controls on fuel? We had gas shortages and gas lines. Now Harris wants to impose the same draconian style price controls on grocery stores. Instead of gas lines, this time we're going to have bread lines. It will be an absolute unmitigated disaster for the American people. And furthermore, it doesn't address the true cause of rising prices. It doesn't address the actual root cause of inflation, which again is the government spending, borrowing, and printing much too much money.
So with the idea of price controls, can you illustrate it for us a little bit? Because it is really interesting how when you put like an artificial price on the market, you mess with supply and demand. Can you talk a little bit about how that works?
Well, if you tell a farmer that he is only allowed to sell a bushel of corn or wheat, or you tell a rancher he is only allowed to sell his cattle for a certain price, well, if that price is below his cost of production, then that farmer or that rancher will literally lose money by bringing that food to the marketplace. And as a result, he or she will choose not to do so because, again, the only way the government will allow him or her to bring that food to market is if he or she is willing to take a loss. Well, guess what? No one is in the business of charity except for charities. Everyone else is in business to make money. And if you make it literally illegal for them to make money, then they will no longer pursue that business. And so you have these dramatic decreases in supply. And that's why you had, for example, in the 1970s, those gasoline shortages. It was literally impossible for producers to bring enough gasoline to market at the prices government was willing to allow them to charge. So that's why you get these incredible shortages whenever a bureaucrat tries to dictate to market participants how much they're actually allowed to charge for their product. And yes, you do limit price growth. That's true. But again, you also limit products and services to the real economy. And clearly, people would be willing to pay more for these because if the quantity goes down, that means that people were willing to pay more before at these higher prices.
Another part of the proposal the vice president has put forward is the idea of subsidizing first-time home buyers in order to make home ownership and housing costs go down. Can you talk about that plan and whether you think that a plan of that type would be successful?
Well, essentially, Mark, this is just another plan to increase demand. The problem is that whenever you increase demand, you're going to put upward pressure on prices. That's not what we want here. That's not going to fix the affordability crisis in housing. But unfortunately, this is what government has been doing literally for decades in the housing market. It's part of the reason why housing is so unaffordable. And it's not just housing. We've seen the exact same policies and therefore the exact same effects in lots of other places. Maybe student loans is the next best example. And actually, the Federal Reserve has even done research on this, where they determined that every time the government increases the amount of aid they're going to give to students, whether that's direct aid or whether that's more student loans, whatever the case may be, schools always respond by increasing costs of attendance, whether that's tuition or other fees. And as a result, the student is not better off. The school is better off. Don't get me wrong. The school is loving this arrangement. Why? Because they are getting more money from the government. It's just that the student is essentially a middleman. but the student ends up graduating with way more debt. In other words, the very people you were trying to help, Mark, are worse off. So if you employ more of the same in housing, where you have yet another demand subsidy, what will happen? You will see buyers able to put more money down. You will see buyers able to offer higher bids on homes, and therefore sellers will start raising prices. And so once again, the very people you're trying to help, these home buyers, are actually going to be the ones who are hurt because home prices are only going to go up. And it's not simply as if home prices will go up by the amount of the subsidy. They will actually go up much more. Let's say, for example, Mark, we're going to subsidize home buyers with $10,000. That will increase home prices by much more than $10,000 because the buyer is only putting that $10,000 down. But let's say you're putting down 10% of the total mortgage. Well, every extra $10,000 that you put down is another $100,000 worth of mortgage. In other words, the increase on home prices is going to be a multiple of the increase in the subsidy. And so it may at first appear as if these home buyers are worse off by whatever the amount of the subsidy is. No. They are worse off by much, much more than that.
Let's say that you could wave your economist's magic wand and do a few things that you think would actually bring down inflation and make goods and services more affordable to the average American. What would you do?
Well, the first thing would be to institute massive regulatory reform. And actually, Mark, this is something that I think the first Trump term did not get enough credit for. And it was that they managed under that administration to institute a tremendous amount of regulatory reform, which actually reduced costs to households by about $2,000 per household per year. So that really added up over the course of 4 years. Conversely, we've seen exactly the opposite under the Biden-Harris administration, where regulatory costs haven't decreased. That burden has actually increased by about $5,000 per household per year. Again, at the end of 4 years, that really adds up. And these regulations cover everything from the kind of car you drive to the kind of home appliances that you can have to just how your home is built, etc. And many times these regulations don't even actually improve people's quality of life. They merely impose additional costs. And so if you can scale that back, you can increase economic growth and you can reduce costs without essentially any negative side effects. So that would be a tremendous help in fighting inflation. But the other big thing, Mark, is getting the spending down. We have to reduce the government spending because at this point, every additional dollar the government spends, they have to borrow because they're already running such a massive deficit. And so if you decrease the spending, that means you decrease the borrowing. And that not only puts less pressure on the Treasury, but it also puts less pressure on the Federal Reserve. So now the Federal Reserve doesn't have to create as much money. In other words, it doesn't have to cause as much inflation to help finance the budget deficit. And on top of that, it will also bring down interest rates because it reduces the demand for borrowed money. And that's what the interest rate is. It's a price for borrowed money. You bring down the demand, you bring down the price. If the government borrows less, interest rates will fall. The fact that the government is borrowing over $2 trillion a year right now is a key reason why mortgage rates went from 2% to 7 or 8%. And so if you can not only bring down prices, but bring down interest rates as well, that is a 1-2 punch to bring down the cost of home ownership for the average American.
EJ Antoni, thank you so much.
Mark, thank you for having me.
Thank you to EJ Antoni for his contribution to today's episode. You can follow EJ on X at @RealEJAntoni, and you can find more of his work at heritage.org. And of course, thank you to you for listening to Heritage Explains. As always, you can reach out to us with thoughts, questions, or suggestions at heritageexplains@heritage.org. Take care. We'll see you next time.
Heritage Explains is written and produced by Mark Gagne, Lauren Evans, and John Popp.